Mark lived on the edge of a growing town where new houses kept appearing every year. His land was quiet and wide and covered with dusty paths and old trees. It had belonged to his family for a long time. His grandfather bought it when the area was mostly empty fields. Mark kept it simple and private because he liked calm days and clear routines. He worked with his hands and fixed small machines in a modest workshop near the back of the property. He also kept 2 storage sheds that held tools and spare parts and boxes of family items. Nothing on the land looked fancy, but everything had a purpose. Mark paid his property taxes on time and kept his papers organized in a metal cabinet. He believed that if a person stayed honest and steady, then life would stay steady too. On a warm morning in early spring, Mark walked to his mailbox with a mug of tea. The sky was pale blue and a light wind pushed leaves across the dirt road. He expected the usual mail like a store flyer or a utility notice. Instead, he saw a thick envelope that looked official. It was heavier than normal and sealed tight. The return address made him pause because it said Green Valley Homeowners Association. Mark stared at the words as if they were written in a different language. He did not live in Green Valley. He had never joined any association. He had never attended any neighborhood meeting. Still, the envelope was addressed to him by full name and correct address. Mark carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table. He washed his hands slowly like he was buying time. Then he opened the envelope with a careful tear along the top. Inside was a formal notice printed on clean white paper. It listed rule numbers and sections and dates and warnings. Mark read the first lines and felt his stomach tighten. The notice claimed he had committed multiple violations on his land. It said his sheds were not approved. It said his workshop was not permitted. It said the appearance of his property did not match community standards. Mark blinked at that phrase because it sounded like someone judging his life from far away. He kept reading, and the words started to feel heavier. At the bottom was a large number in bold. $250,000. Mark set the paper down and took a slow breath. He read it again to make sure he had not mistaken the amount. The notice said the fine would increase if he did not pay quickly. It said the association could place a lien on his property. It said legal action could follow. Mark was not easily shaken, but the number made his hands go cold. He was not a rich man in the way people assumed when they saw land. He had savings and he had stability, but he did not have money to throw into a hole. Most of what he owned was tied up in the property itself. He looked around his kitchen and felt the room turn quiet in a different way. Mark went to his metal cabinet and pulled out his files. He found the deed and old survey maps and tax receipts. He laid them out on the table beside the notice. His deed showed the boundaries clearly. His survey showed landmarks and measurements. The dates were old and solid. The papers showed that his property existed long before Green Valley was built. Mark followed the lines with his finger and tried to understand how an association could claim authority over him. The notice included a statement that his land was within the Green Valley managed area. Mark knew that was not true based on everything he had ever been told. But he also knew that official paper sometimes scared people into paying. He decided that panic would not help him. Facts would help him. He called the phone number printed on the notice. A recorded voice answered and directed him through menu options. When someone finally picked up the line, a cheerful voice introduced herself as a representative. Mark explained that he did not live in the neighborhood and did not understand the fine. The representative asked for his address and then spoke with a confident tone. She said the association records showed his property as part of their jurisdiction. Mark asked how that could be possible. She replied that the developer included all nearby parcels for consistency. That answer made Mark frown because it sounded like a shortcut dressed up as a rule. He asked to see the documents that proved it. She told him the board handled those matters and suggested he attend the next meeting. Mark asked for the meeting date and location, and she read it to him quickly. Then she reminded him the fine was due soon. Mark thanked her and ended the call without raising his voice. After the call, Mark sat still for a few minutes. He listened to the refrigerator hum and the distant sound of a passing car. He thought about his grandfather and the way he used to speak about land like it was a promise. His grandfather always said you keep your boundaries clear and your words even clearer. Mark did not want to fight with anyone. He also refused to be pushed around by strangers with a letterhead. He decided he would go to the meeting and speak politely and firmly. He would ask for proof and he would keep records of everything. If they had made a mistake, then they would correct it. If they had not made a mistake, then Mark would learn exactly what they thought they could do. Over the next few days, Mark noticed small changes around him. A pickup truck drove by slower than usual. 2 people stood near the neighborhood entrance and looked toward his land. Mark did not know if it was connected to the notice or if he was simply noticing more because he felt alert. Either way, he kept his routine steady. He worked in his workshop and repaired an old generator for a friend. He checked the fence line and made sure the gate latch worked. He walked the property and looked at the sheds and saw nothing wrong. They were simple structures that had stood for years. They were not dangerous. They were not messy. They were not harming anyone. The idea that someone could label them a violation felt unfair and personal. On the evening before the meeting, Mark gathered his papers into a folder. He included the deed and survey and tax records and photos of the sheds. He also wrote down a few questions on a notepad. He asked when the association was formed. He asked what document placed his land under their rules. He asked who signed it and on what date. He asked why no one had contacted him before sending such a huge fine. Mark did not plan to argue in circles. He planned to get answers and move forward. The next day he drove to the community hall listed on the notice. The parking lot was full of clean cars lined up neatly. A sign near the door welcomed residents to the monthly meeting. Mark walked in and saw rows of chairs facing a table at the front. Behind the table sat 3 board members with name cards. People talked in low voices and glanced at Mark as he entered. Some looked curious and some looked annoyed as if he was a problem arriving on schedule. Mark took a seat near the aisle and held his folder on his lap. He reminded himself to stay calm and clear. He reminded himself that truth did not need shouting. Then he waited for the meeting to begin and for his name to be called. The meeting began with a steady tone and a calm voice from the chairwoman named Linda. She welcomed everyone and spoke about routine matters like landscaping and parking rules. Mark listened quietly while holding his folder close. He noticed how confident the board members looked as they spoke to the room. They smiled often and nodded as if everything was under control. When Linda finally asked if there was any new business, Mark raised his hand slowly. The room became quieter as people turned to look at him. Linda asked him to stand and state his concern. Mark stood and introduced himself in a calm voice. He said he received a notice about violations and a large fine. He said he believed there had been a mistake. Linda nodded politely and asked him to explain further. Mark explained that his land was not part of the neighborhood. He explained that he never agreed to any association rules. He explained that his property existed long before the houses nearby were built. As he spoke, he noticed a few people shifting in their seats. Some neighbors whispered to each other while others crossed their arms. Linda responded with a measured tone. She said the association records showed his land inside their managed area. She said consistency and community standards mattered. Mark asked calmly to see the document that placed his land under their authority. Linda glanced at Paul, who sat beside her. Paul cleared his throat and said the developer handled those matters years ago. He said the board trusted those records. Mark asked again for a copy of the agreement. Paul said such records were archived and not easily accessible. Mark felt a small ripple of concern in the room. Mark opened his folder and held up his deed. He explained what the boundaries showed. He explained how the dates proved his land came first. He spoke slowly so everyone could follow. Linda listened, but her smile tightened. She said associations sometimes expanded to protect property values. She said rules applied evenly for the good of the community. Mark replied that rules required consent and proof. He asked why no one contacted him before sending such a massive fine. Linda said notices were sent based on compliance reviews. A man in the audience stood and said the sheds looked old. Another neighbor said standards mattered to protect investments. Mark looked at them and replied without anger. He said he respected their homes and their choices. He said his land was his responsibility and not theirs. He said he kept it safe and lawful. The room grew tense but quiet again. Linda announced that the fine would stand until reviewed. She said Mark could appeal formally in writing. She said payment deadlines would remain active. Mark asked if penalties would pause during review. Paul said no because the association had authority. That answer caused murmurs across the room. Mark nodded slowly and sat down. He felt a mix of frustration and focus. He realized this was not a simple misunderstanding. After the meeting, people filed out in small groups. Some avoided Mark while others glanced at him with curiosity. One older neighbor named Carl stopped near him. Carl said quietly that Mark should be careful. He said the board did not like being questioned. Mark thanked him and walked outside into the evening air. The parking lot lights cast long shadows on the pavement. Mark stood beside his truck and took a deep breath. On the drive home, Mark replayed every word in his mind. He felt certain the board lacked real proof. He also felt certain they believed they held power. That combination worried him. At home, he placed his folder on the table again. He added notes from the meeting. He wrote down names and statements. He decided he needed stronger support. The next morning, Mark called a local records office. He asked for historic property maps. He asked about easements and development agreements. The clerk said it might take time to gather everything. Mark said he was willing to wait. Later that day, he called an old lawyer friend named Ben. Ben listened carefully as Mark explained the situation. Ben did not interrupt until Mark finished. Then Ben said something that caught Mark's attention. He said developers often left details buried in old filings. Over the next week, Mark received another letter from the association. The tone was firmer and less polite. It warned of escalating action if payment was not made. Mark did not panic, but he did feel pressure. He continued gathering documents patiently. Ben agreed to look through everything once it arrived. Days passed and Mark noticed more signs of tension. A notice appeared near the neighborhood entrance mentioning enforcement. Someone placed orange markers near the edge of his land. Mark removed them and set them aside. He documented everything with photos. He knew records mattered. Finally, the records office called. They said the files were ready for review. Mark drove there the same afternoon. He sat at a long table covered with maps and papers. As he studied them, his brow tightened. Lines overlapped in ways he did not expect. Old notes referenced access rights and shared utilities. Mark copied everything carefully. That evening, Ben arrived at Mark's house. They spread the documents across the table. Ben traced lines with his finger and nodded slowly. He said the association might have made a serious mistake. Mark asked what he meant. Ben said some rights tied to Mark's land affected the entire neighborhood. He said they needed to read further before drawing conclusions. Mark felt a quiet shift inside him. What began as a fine now felt like something much larger. As night settled in, Mark looked out toward the neighborhood lights. He felt calm but alert. He knew the next steps would matter. He did not want conflict, but he would not accept pressure built on weak ground. The truth was in the papers, and he was determined to follow it wherever it led. Mark and Ben worked late into the night at the kitchen table, and the papers stayed spread out like a map of hidden history. Ben used small sticky notes to mark pages, and he wrote short labels like easement and right-of-way and master deed. Mark watched closely and tried to connect every line to something real in the world outside his window. Ben explained that land ownership was not only about the surface and fences, but also about rights that travel with a deed. Mark listened and felt his worry turn into focus because facts were finally replacing opinions. Ben pointed to an old agreement between a developer and Mark's grandfather, and he said the language here was the key. The agreement talked about roads and utilities and access through Mark's land so the future neighborhood could function. Mark remembered his grandfather mentioning a handshake deal long ago, but he never imagined it was this detailed. Ben said the developer built the neighborhood while relying on those rights, and that reliance created a chain that still mattered today. Mark asked if that meant the HOA could claim control over him, and Ben said it was the opposite if the records were correct. The next day, Ben visited the county office with Mark to request certified copies of the most important documents. They waited in a quiet lobby with beige walls and a slow ceiling fan spinning above them. A clerk brought out a thick packet and set it down with a firm sound that made Mark tense for a moment. Ben flipped through the pages and nodded to himself as he scanned signatures and dates. Mark saw his grandfather's name and felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. It was like his grandfather had left him a message but hid it inside legal words. Ben told Mark to stay patient because the strongest truth often looked boring on paper. Mark agreed and decided to read everything line by line that evening. Back at home, Mark sat with a highlighter and carefully read each paragraph. He found a section describing the land as a hub for shared access and he underlined it. He found another section describing mineral and utility rights that were never fully transferred and he underlined that too. The more he read, the more the fine letter from the HOA felt like a bad joke. Mark realized the HOA did not just lack authority over his land, but might be standing on rights that belonged to him. That thought felt heavy because it was not about winning a fight but about power and what people do with it. Mark had no desire to control anyone's home. He only wanted to live quietly and be treated fairly. 2 days later, Mark received a new notice from the HOA delivered by a courier in a neat uniform. The envelope was stamped urgent and the tone inside was sharper than before. It demanded immediate payment and threatened more action if he ignored the deadline. Mark read it once and placed it beside the earlier notice. He did not call them this time. Instead, he called Ben and told him they needed to respond properly and quickly. Ben came over that afternoon with his laptop and a printer. He drafted a formal letter requesting evidence of authority and a pause on penalties during review. He included references to county filings and asked for copies of any documents the HOA claimed to rely on. Mark signed the letter and Ben arranged for it to be delivered with proof. Mark felt calmer after that because he was no longer reacting to threats and he was building his own path. That evening, Mark walked along the edge of his property where the neighborhood began. A paved road ran close to his boundary, and the streetlights made the sidewalks glow. He noticed a utility access box near the curb, and he suddenly wondered whose rights controlled it. Ben had mentioned utilities more than once, and now Mark saw them everywhere. He saw the water lines marked on the maps in his mind. He saw the power access routes. He saw the service road behind the houses that connected to a gate near his land. All of it felt connected like threads tied to the same knot. The next morning, Ben called Mark with a new discovery. Ben had found a recorded document titled Master Declaration that referenced Mark's family parcel as the anchor parcel. Ben explained that it meant the neighborhood was built under a legal framework that depended on rights attached to Mark's land. Mark asked what that changed. Ben said if the agreement that allowed those rights had an expiration clause, then the neighborhood might need renewal or renegotiation. Mark felt his heart beat faster because the HOA was acting like a ruler while ignoring the foundation under its own feet. Ben asked Mark to meet him at his office where he had access to a larger database. Mark drove there and found Ben waiting with printed diagrams. Ben pointed to a clause that stated certain permissions would remain valid only while the developer operated under the original plan. Ben then pointed to a later document showing the developer sold out years ago. Mark asked if that meant the plan ended. Ben said not exactly, but it meant the permissions had conditions and those conditions might have been broken or expired. Mark stared at the dates and felt the story turning in a way he did not expect. Ben leaned back and said something that made Mark sit very still. Ben said the HOA may have been collecting dues and enforcing rules while missing a required renewal step. Ben said if they failed to renew properly, then their authority over the neighborhood itself could be limited. Mark asked how something so big could be missed. Ben said when everyone assumes a system works, people stop checking the smallest pages. Mark remembered Linda's confidence and Paul's dismissal and Nina's sharp voice, and it all started to make sense. They did not want questions because questions lead to paper, and paper leads to truth. Mark returned home and found another change near his land. 2 men in bright vests were taking photos of his sheds from the roadside. Mark walked up calmly and asked who sent them. One man said they worked for a compliance contractor hired by the HOA. Mark asked them to step off his property line, and they did. Mark did not shout, but he did take his own photos of them and their vehicle. The men left quickly after that, and Mark stood watching the road for a long moment. He felt the pressure rising, but he also felt stronger because he had facts and a plan. That night Ben sent Mark a set of documents to review before their next move. One document showed a small but important detail that Mark almost missed at first. It was a schedule listing parcels and a note that the anchor parcel retained controlling rights over access and certain easements. Mark read it again and again to make sure he understood. He called Ben and asked if that meant he could legally limit access. Ben said in some cases yes, but they must be careful and follow proper steps. Mark said he did not want to limit anyone's basic needs. Ben said they could propose a fair agreement that protects everyone while correcting the HOA's overreach. A few days later Mark received an email from the HOA board inviting him to a private meeting. The message was written by Linda, and it sounded polite but firm. It said the board wanted to resolve the matter without conflict. Mark read between the lines and felt they had realized something. Ben agreed and said this was the moment to stay calm and professional. They planned to attend together and bring certified documents and a clear statement. Mark agreed and spent the night preparing his notes. He knew the next meeting would decide whether this ended peacefully or turned into a bigger legal fight. On the day of the private meeting, Mark and Ben arrived at the community hall early. The room was smaller than the monthly meeting room and the chairs were placed closer together. Linda sat at the table with Paul and Nina, and their faces looked more serious than before. They greeted Mark with tight smiles and offered water. Mark sat down and placed his folder on the table with quiet confidence. Ben placed his own folder beside it and opened to a page already marked. Linda began by saying the board wanted clarity. Mark nodded and said he wanted the same thing. Ben spoke next and asked for the document that gave the HOA authority over Mark's land. Paul avoided Ben's eyes and said they were still locating it. Ben then slid forward the master declaration and the anchor parcel schedule. Linda's expression changed as she read the first page. Nina's posture stiffened and she stopped tapping her pen. Paul swallowed and asked where Ben got those copies. Ben said they were public records and he had certified copies. Mark watched their faces and understood that the board was no longer confident. The fine letter had been a weapon, and now it was turning back toward the people who sent it. Ben explained calmly that Mark's land was not under the HOA and never had been. Ben explained that the neighborhood relied on rights tied to Mark's parcel, and those rights required proper handling. Linda tried to keep her voice steady, but she asked what Mark wanted. Mark answered simply that he wanted the fine removed and a written correction. He also wanted the harassment to stop and the contractors to stay off his boundary line. Ben added that a fair agreement could be discussed for future access rights if needed. The room went quiet, and the board members exchanged quick glances. Mark felt the story reaching the edge of a turning point, and he knew the next words from the board would decide everything. Linda sat very still as Ben finished speaking, and the quiet in the room felt heavier than any argument. Paul stared at the papers as if he hoped the words would change if he looked long enough. Nina held her pen but stopped tapping because she seemed to realize the situation was no longer in her control. Mark kept his hands folded and stayed calm because he did not come to attack anyone. He came to stop the pressure and to protect what his family built with honest work. Linda cleared her throat and tried to regain the tone she used in public meetings. She said the board acted in good faith based on the records they had. Ben replied gently but firmly that good faith still required proof and careful review. Ben pointed again to the certified documents and explained that the HOA had no legal reach over Mark's parcel. Ben also explained that the neighborhood itself relied on the anchor parcel rights to function in key ways. Linda asked what that meant in simple terms. Ben said it meant the neighborhood used access and utility permissions connected to Mark's land. Ben said those permissions were not a gift that could be taken for granted, and they were not tools to threaten Mark. Mark watched Linda's face and saw her confidence slipping into worry. Paul finally spoke, and his voice sounded smaller than before. He asked if Mark was saying he owned the whole neighborhood. Mark did not smile or brag because that was not his style. He simply said the paperwork showed his family retained controlling rights tied to the original development plan. Ben added that ownership and controlling rights are not the same as wanting to control people. Ben said Mark could choose a fair path that keeps everyone stable. Nina looked up and asked if Mark planned to shut anything down. Mark answered clearly that he had no intention of harming families or disrupting daily life. He said he wanted respect and legal correctness and peace. Linda took a slow breath and asked what Mark wanted in writing. Ben slid a single page across the table that listed simple terms. The HOA would withdraw the fine immediately. The HOA would remove any notices or penalties tied to Mark's property. The HOA would send a written statement confirming Mark's land was not part of their jurisdiction. The HOA would stop sending contractors to photograph or mark Mark's boundary. Then the parties would schedule a separate meeting to discuss an updated access and easement agreement if needed. Ben said the updated agreement could include clear responsibilities so no one lived with uncertainty. Linda read the page twice and looked at Paul and Nina. Paul asked if they could take time to review it with their legal counsel. Ben said they could, but the threats and deadlines must stop today. Ben said keeping the fine active after receiving proof would create bigger problems for the board. Mark remained quiet but steady, and his silence carried weight. Linda asked Mark one more question, and her voice softened. She asked why Mark had never mentioned any of this before. Mark said he did not know he needed to. He said he lived his life and paid his taxes and expected others to do the same. He said he never imagined an association would send a giant fine without checking basic facts. The board asked for a short break to speak privately. Mark and Ben stepped into the hallway. The community hall smelled like fresh paint and cleaning soap. Mark looked out a window at the neat lawns and the bright streetlights outside. He did not feel angry now, and he felt something closer to sadness. He thought about how quickly power can make people forget manners. Ben told Mark he handled himself well and that calm often wins where shouting fails. Mark nodded and said he only wanted to go home and return to his normal life. After several minutes, Linda opened the door and invited them back in. Her posture was straighter, but her eyes showed caution. She said the board agreed to withdraw the fine immediately. She said they would send a written correction within 48 hours. She said they would stop all enforcement actions related to Mark's land. Paul added that any contractors would be instructed to stay away from Mark's boundary. Nina said they would remove any markers and internal notes that listed Mark as part of the HOA. Mark listened and felt the pressure in his chest loosen slightly. He asked for the withdrawal in writing, and Ben said the same. Linda agreed and signed a short statement on the spot that Ben had prepared. For a moment, the room felt calmer, as if everyone could breathe again. Then Linda asked about the future, and her tone was careful now. She said the neighborhood needed stability, and residents needed certainty. She asked if Mark would be willing to sign a renewed agreement that kept access rights clear. Mark looked at Ben and then back at Linda. He said he was open to a fair agreement that protects everyone. He said he wanted a simple rule for the future. No one sends threats first. People talk first. People verify first. Linda nodded and said she understood. Paul apologized in a quiet voice and admitted they relied too much on assumptions. Nina apologized too and said she thought strict enforcement was the only way to keep order. Mark accepted the apologies without making a speech. He said mistakes happen, but the next step is what matters. He said the board should focus on serving residents rather than chasing power. The room became quiet again, but this time the quiet felt healthier. 2 days later Mark received the written withdrawal and the official correction. The amount on the fine was replaced by the words withdrawn in clear language. The letter stated Mark's land was not under HOA authority and never had been. It also stated the board would not pursue any action against him. Mark placed the letter in his cabinet beside the deed and the maps. He felt relief, but he also felt a new sense of responsibility. A week later Mark and Ben met with the board again in a more respectful setting. This time the mood was different because everyone understood where they stood. Ben explained a proposed agreement in simple terms that protected utility access and maintenance routes. Mark asked for clear boundaries and clear notice requirements. Linda agreed and suggested a joint contact process so misunderstandings would not grow into threats again. The agreement included basic fairness and clear rules that applied equally. The board would maintain certain access areas and would provide written notice before any work near Mark's boundary. Mark would allow access for necessary maintenance under defined conditions. Both sides would keep records and communicate through a single channel. When the meeting ended Mark walked out into the afternoon light and felt calm again. The neighborhood looked the same as before with trimmed grass and clean sidewalks. But the feeling was different because the balance had shifted back to truth. Mark drove home and passed the edge of his land where the old trees stood. He stepped out of his truck and listened to the wind moving through the leaves. He felt grateful for his grandfather's careful choices and patient planning. He also felt proud of himself for staying steady under pressure. In the weeks that followed, neighbors treated Mark differently. Some waved when they passed. Carl stopped by once with a small box of pastries and said he was glad the truth came out. Mark thanked him and kept the moment simple. He did not become a local hero, and he did not seek attention. He returned to his workshop and fixed machines and lived quietly like he always had. The HOA also changed in small visible ways. New meeting notes focused on practical needs instead of harsh enforcement. The board spoke more carefully and used less threatening language. Mark did not expect everyone to become perfect overnight. But he saw a shift toward respect, and that was enough. The fine that once felt like a storm became a lesson written on paper. Mark kept that paper safe not as a trophy but as proof that truth matters. And every time an official letter arrived after that, it carried a new tone. It spoke to Mark as a neighbor and as a landowner with rights that could not be ignored.